The police told him to never break his curfew again, and now he understands why. A lonely veteran in a red and black buffalo plaid jacket tried to rebuild his life in the frozen outskirts of Anchorage. But one blizzard night, his German shepherd wouldn't stop howling at a deadly cliffside. When he chose to silence his only lifeline to stay free, and followed his dog into the storm. They found a woman fighting for her last breath, and a truth buried so deep it nearly destroyed him. What happened next would shock a judge, expose a crime, and change 3 lives forever. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, your city, state, or country. We love seeing how far these stories can travel. The winter wind gnawed at the pine-covered outskirts of Anchorage, turning breath into ice before it could even leave a man's chest. Frank Walker, 62 years old, spine tired from years of military packs, and the invisible weight of memory, sat alone at the edge of his small wooden cabin, staring at a horizon smothered by snow. He wore the same thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket, every day the fabric worn at the shoulders, stitched by his own shaky hands, in places no one noticed. His face was rugged with age, salt and pepper beard, rough as Arctic bark skin, toughened by desert sun long before the Alaskan cold began carving new lines into him. His gray eyes carried the same storm that now rolled across the sky, dark, unpredictable, and holding back something broken. Silence was Frank's oldest enemy and newest friend. It reminded him of the Middle East, of the nights when artillery fell quiet right before reality tore open again. But it also kept people away, people who might judge a man for what he could not hide. There was only one soul he trusted, Ranger, a 6-year-old German shepherd, with a silver and black coat thick enough to fight winter itself. Ranger's ears stood alert even when he slept, one perfectly pointed, the other slightly bent, a permanent reminder of a roadside blast that had left him partially deaf. His amber eyes tracked every flicker of emotion on Frank's face, as though the dog still believed reading humans could save lives. Ranger wasn't just a pet. He was a fellow veteran, a guardian, and the last tether, pulling Frank back from the edge when nightmares tried to drag him under. Morning came with no mercy, as always. Frank laced up his boots, steel toe scuffed from years of fixing whatever rusted in this cold town, and climbed into his aging Ford pickup. Anchorage felt like a place that only kept the hopeful if they were too stubborn to know they should leave. He arrived at Iron North Auto Repair, a box-shaped building with a peeling sign that once promised reliable service. Inside, the air always smelled of gasoline and a hint of desperation. Derek Samuels, his boss, was already pacing. Derek was in his mid-40s with slicked-back blonde hair that never quite hid his receding hairline, a cheap leather jacket hugging a frame that looked like it resented manual labor. His blue eyes were restless pupils darting like a man forever calculating the next shortcut. He laughed loudly, but never laughed with people, only at them. Frank suspected Derek had once dreamed of being important, and failing, that he settled for being in charge. "Frank, we got deadlines." Derek barked from above the engine bay of a semi-truck, tapping his fingers against a clipboard, as if the world needed to speed up. Frank grunted acknowledgement and popped the hood of the truck. The engine was a beast, built to drag tons of cargo across treacherous Alaskan routes. Truckers trusted mechanics with their lives, though they rarely said it. Frank inspected the lateral control rod, what kept the truck from swerving off the highway at 60 miles per hour. It looked wrong. Too light. He ran a calloused thumb over the metal, sensing the cheapness of the alloy instantly. The container stamp confirmed his suspicion. It wasn't the durable steel required for long-haul rigs. It was inferior, dangerously so. Derek Frank called out, voice firm but calm, "This part won't hold. Replace it with OEM." Derek froze and turned, wearing a smile that didn't belong on a human face. Suppliers change all the time. That rod's fine, he said, voice coated with irritation disguised as charm. Frank shook his head. No, it'll fail. Someone will die. Derek approached, lowering his voice. Frank, don't make trouble. Just install the damn thing. Frank didn't snap often, but he snapped then. I buried enough good men in my life. I won't send more to the grave for a lousy bonus. Derek's eyes narrowed, the mask slipping. His voice grated through clenched teeth. You think you're some hero? You're just a washed-up mechanic hiding in the woods so nobody sees you shaking every time a door slams. The words hit deeper than Derek knew, but Frank stood taller anyway, gaze unwavering. Pull the part, he demanded. Derek finally relented with a sarcastic salute, but something dark simmered in his stare. That night, exhaustion stuck to Frank like frost. Derek approached him again with papers, just a shipment form, he claimed. Frank skimmed, saw only standard supplies, filters, hydraulic fluid, brake cleaner. He signed. He didn't see the one line buried among them, microprocessor control unit value $48,000. He didn't see Derek slip an empty packaging box into the back of his truck as Frank left. The cabin welcomed him with warmth from the wood stove and a nudge from Ranger's nose. But before he could savor the comfort, morning arrived with sirens. 2 county sheriff cruisers rolled into the driveway. Ranger growled low, fur bristling like a wolf ready to protect its pack. Officer Henry Carter stepped out first, a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s with crow's feet from either genuine smiles or constant suspicion. Today, his face held none of the former. Thomas Franklin Walker Carter called out reading from a warrant. Frank nodded slowly, confusion rising like a tide. We have probable cause to search these premises for stolen property. Frank's throat dried. What stolen property? They didn't answer. They didn't need to. One deputy walked straight to the trash bin outside, too straight, as if he knew exactly where to look, and lifted the torn component packaging Derek planted. Here it is, the deputy shouted. Ranger barked sharply, lunging forward, but Frank placed a calming hand on his neck, trying to soothe the dog who now cared more about justice than any human in sight. Carter's gaze softened momentarily, seeing the betrayal twist in Frank's expression. But duty was colder than compassion. Turn around, sir. Hands behind your back. The cuffs locked with a metallic finality that echoed against the trees louder than the wind. Ranger cried a heartbreaking sound, half whine, half howl, as Frank was guided away. The dog pressed forward, desperate to follow, but Carter blocked him with a quiet warning gesture. We'll make sure someone looks after the dog, the officer muttered, though Frank could hear the lie trembling beneath the promise. Ranger remained in the snow, ears pinned back, amber eyes locked onto the man he owed his life to, the only man who had never abandoned him. And Frank, shoved into the cruiser's cold back seat, felt his heart fracture, not because he was accused of a crime he didn't commit, but because the world was stealing from him the only loyal companion left in his winter-bound life. The engine started. The siren wailed. Ranger's howl chased the car down the road, echoing through the frozen pines like a prayer. Frank didn't believe in prayers anymore, but he believed in that dog. And he believed someone out there wanted to destroy him for knowing the truth. Tonight, winter would grow darker, and the war he thought he left behind would come roaring back right here in Anchorage. The cold inside the holding cell felt different from the cold outside. It wasn't nature's doing, but the chill of judgment, the kind that settled deep into a man's bones and made him question whether the world wanted him at all. Frank Walker sat on a metal bench bolted to the wall, staring at the faded white paint that carried the scars of fists and keys and years of hopelessness. His hands, still strong despite age, rested on his knees, but his shoulders sagged with a weight he hadn't carried during wartime defeat. Ranger wasn't here. The silence where the dog should have been hurt more than any cuffs pressing into his skin. A door clanged open, and a young man stepped inside holding a folder too thick for comfort. Leo Finch, appointed public defender, couldn't be a year over 27. His dark hair was uncombed bags under his brown eyes, suggesting he survived on coffee and anxiety. His suit was wrinkled like he'd pulled it from the floor of his car. Despite the disarray, there was a sincerity in the way he stood, like a kid who truly believed fairness still existed if you fought for it hard enough. "Mr. Walker." Leo began, voice trying to sound confident but wobbling slightly. "I've negotiated temporary release while we fight the charges. But..." He exhaled slowly and sat across from Frank. "There are strict conditions attached." Frank answered with silence, the kind that made Leo rub his hands nervously. "You are to remain inside your home every night by 800 p.m. sharp. They can't give you a GPS tracker right now. They're out of devices after budget cuts, so your probation officer will call your landline to check you're there." Leo cleared his throat as if preparing to say something worse. "If you don't answer, or if there's noise that suggests you're anywhere but home, they'll send a patrol car. You'll be back in here before sunrise." Frank's eyes narrowed. "And Ranger," Leo swallowed, biting down anxiety before speaking. "If you violate the curfew, animal control will take him. They'll evaluate his behavior. With his trauma history and the fact he's a working breed veteran dog." Leo paused, voice softer. He might not qualify for rehoming. They'd likely mark him as aggressive. Death. They meant death. Frank's fists clenched so hard his knuckles whitened. He stared past Leo, vision blurring with a fury he forced down, because veterans learned long ago that anger frightened civilians. "He's all I got," Frank said quietly, steel hidden behind each word. "I know," Leo replied, and for once his voice was completely steady. "That's why you have to follow every rule." Hours later, Ranger leapt into Frank's arms at the station exit, nearly knocking him off balance. The dog whined softly, burying his muzzle against Frank's flannel jacket, inhaling his scent like he needed to confirm it was real. Frank gripped the thick fur around Ranger's neck, anchoring himself in the dog's warmth. "Let's go home," Frank whispered, though home no longer felt safe. Back at the cabin, the probation officer arrived without warning. Officer Warren Grimes stepped onto Frank's porch, like a man claiming enemy territory. Mid-50s, barrel-chested haircut, military style, though he'd never served, Frank could tell. He carried authority like a weapon, chin high, eyes sharp behind rectangular glasses. His mustache, salt and pepper like Frank's beard, twitched each time he spoke, signaling irritation was his default state. "I don't care what you did in the Corps," Grimes said, scanning the small living room like he might find contraband hidden inside the walls. "Here you are, a defendant, a risk, a man who's already made one wrong choice." Frank said nothing, because anything he said would be used to label him a problem. Grimes held up a sheet of paper. "Read this. Memorize it. Live by it." And then he recited the words like scripture. "Curfew, 8:00 p.m. Phone must be answered on first ring. No excuses." Ranger stood between them, body tense, tail still. One growl, and Frank would lose him forever. Frank forced his voice calm. "I understand." Grimes looked unconvinced, but eventually left, slamming the door, because quiet goodbyes weren't part of his job description. The cabin fell into oppressive quiet. Ranger rested his head on Frank's thigh, trying to soothe the tension the dog could smell but not solve. Frank brushed Ranger's ear, speaking to fill the silence as much as reassure himself. "We'll manage. We always have." But he didn't believe it. The next 3 days passed like slow torture. Frank had no job. Derek ensured nobody in town would hire a mechanic accused of theft. Bills stacked like accusations on the kitchen table. Ranger sensed every moment Frank's mind slipped into dark corners, nudging him, reminding him the present was still real. Then the phone rang. Frank answered fast, heart jumping, as if expecting another blow. "Frank, it's Jim Patterson." The voice belonged to a man Frank once helped, a bulky lodge owner in his 60s with a permanently sunburned nose and friendly paunch from years of beer and barbecue. Jim was the kind who treated everyone like a cousin he liked enough to lend money to, but never expected back. "I'm in trouble," Jim confessed. "The delivery truck broke down. I've got guests arriving tomorrow. My furnace is working overtime and I need seasoned firewood fast." Frank's eyes moved to the pile of bills. "Jim, I can't drive far." "500 cash," Jim said quickly, already sensing refusal. "Just one run to the lodge. You're the only one I trust. Please." Frank's pulse surged with both hope and dread. Jim's lodge sat north of the city, almost 2 hours away. Round trip 4 hours, too long. Curfew would swallow him whole. He looked down at Ranger, who watched him with those amber eyes filled with devotion too pure for this world. "500 keeps the lights on," Frank murmured. Jim waited silent and desperate. Frank calculated like a soldier planning an impossible mission. If he left within the hour, loaded quickly, no traffic beat the storm, he might make it home by 8 herung. Might. "All right, Jim," he finally said. "I'll do it." "You're a lifesaver," Jim replied, unaware of how literal that word would soon become. The sky darkened as Frank and Ranger drove along the snowy highway. Ranger sat alert, ears perked at each gust of wind that shoved the truck sideways. The radio crackled storm warnings, Arctic winds rolling off the ocean, turning the world blind 1 mile at a time. Frank delivered the wood sweat freezing against his back from how fast he worked. Jim shoved an envelope thick with cash into his coat pocket, thanking him over and over. But time slipped away like sand through numb fingers. On the way back, the storm fell like a curtain. Visibility gone. Wind screaming. Road ice waiting to kill. Ranger shifted anxiously, sensing danger long before humans would understand it. Frank shoved the truck forward, almost whispering a prayer he no longer believed in. "We make it home. We have to." Every mile was a gamble. Every minute shaved from curfew was borrowed from fate. At 7:15 p.m. he was still far from Anchorage. Sweat rolled despite the cold panic rising. Ranger pawed the window. Suddenly ears pricked forward, a low growl rumbling from deep in his chest, not at the storm, at something else. Frank's hands tightened on the wheel. "Not now, boy. Don't let there be something out there in the dark. Not tonight." The road had dissolved into a white abyss, a blizzard thick enough to erase the world one gust at a time, and Frank Walker leaned forward in the driver's seat, as if his body alone could force the truck through the storm. The windshield wipers struggled, scraping sheets of sleet aside, but unveiling only more chaos beyond. The clock glowed 7:37 p.m., reminding him he was already running thin on time. Ranger, his German Shepherd companion, crouched low on the passenger seat, a soul coiled tight. Ears rotated forward like a radar locked onto something unseen. His amber eyes flicked to the right window, then back toward Frank, whimpering a warning. Frank tried to ignore the growing dread in his stomach. He gripped the steering wheel, knuckles whitening beneath worn skin. His breath fogged inside the cab, fear thick in the air. "We're cutting it close, boy," he muttered, trying to sound calm, though panic clawed at his ribs. Ranger suddenly lurched toward the passenger window, barking in short, sharp bursts, a sound Frank recognized not as aggression or fear, but alert someone was in trouble. Frank eased the truck to a halt, tires slipping on ice as the vehicle shuddered against the wind. Ranger's body trembled with urgency, now paws clawing at the glass. Frank squinted through the blinding snow, and after a moment his eyes made out a faint, unnatural shape on the slope. A dark metal silhouette pitched against the snowy ravine. It was a car, no, an SUV, tilted dangerously over the edge of a frozen creek. Its rear wheels spun uselessly, like the vehicle was still fighting to stay alive, though its driver no longer could. Frank's chest hammered. A wrong move and that car would topple straight down into the ice below. Ranger barked again, frantic. Frank swallowed and nodded as if answering a command. "I see it, boy." Beneath the howl of the storm, he could hear the crackle of stressed metal from the SUV's frame. The headlights flickered weakly, casting a ghostly cone through the blizzard. He grabbed the flashlight, exiting into the violence of the wind. Ranger bounded into the snow beside him, tail-rigid posture, alert, barking louder. Frank steadied himself, knees stiff from age but driven by instinct older than fear. He trudged downward, boots sliding across ice, Ranger, guiding him like they were back in combat zones where one trusted the dog first and eyesight second. As they neared, Frank spotted a woman slumped over the steering wheel. Her hair, dark brown, long tangled, fell forward, covering most of her face. Her skin was pale, nearly blue, lips trembling against the cold, though she appeared unconscious. Frost clung to the windows inside, proof she had been trapped long enough for death to begin staking a claim. Frank's heart clenched. She was young, maybe early 30s. Her features were delicate beneath her harsh fate. A narrow jawline, high cheekbones, a slight frame dressed in a cream winter coat, now stained with dirt and fear. She wore a simple silver band on her left hand, not a wedding ring, but something sentimental. A bracelet hung loose on her wrist, made of woven thread, and small wooden beads, a handmade gift, perhaps now frozen stiff. She looked like someone who had once been happy, someone who still believed in ordinary life before the road betrayed her. Frank's mind raced. He tapped the window, shouting over the storm, "Ma'am, hey, can you hear me?" The woman didn't move. Ranger whined, pushing against Frank's thigh, urging action. Frank assessed the situation like a battlefield medic, no time, unstable vehicle, freezing temperatures, and a life hanging by the thinnest thread. He climbed toward the back of the SUV, pulling a tow chain from the truck bed. The slope was steep, and the wind shoved him sideways with each breath. He looped the chain around the undercarriage and anchored the other end to the Ford's rear hitch, then tugged hard, praying the connection would hold. He returned to the door, trying the handle. Locked. He cursed under his breath, lifted his flashlight, and slammed it against the glass. The window shattered, inward snow rushing in like a predator. Ranger barked encouragement. Frank reached in, brushing broken glass aside his cold fingers, searching the woman's pulse at her neck. Weak. Impossible to feel at first. But there. He leaned closer. She was breathing shallow but stubborn. "Stay with me, Frank," whispered voice, suddenly soft, a soldier speaking to another soul, refusing to surrender. He unlatched the door from inside and pulled her out carefully, afraid to shift weight too abruptly and send them both sliding down into icy death. Ranger pressed close, body heat, a small salvation against winter's jaws. Together they dragged the woman inch by agonizing inch up the slope, Frank's muscles burning with the effort. Halfway up, she coughed weakly, eyes fluttering open for a flicker of a moment. Blue eyes, bright but clouded with fear, met Frank's. Her voice was a cracked whisper, "Help! Please." Frank nodded, panting. "You're okay now. I've got you." He didn't know if it was true, but belief sometimes saved lives before reality did. They reached the truck, Frank opening the passenger door and lifting her inside, wrapping Ranger's blanket around her shoulders. Ranger curled beside her, pressing close, providing calm warmth he had once been trained to give returning soldiers mid-panic. Frank reached for his phone, 7:58 p.m. The screen lit up with an incoming call, Probation Officer Grimes, The sound sliced into him like a blade. He hesitated, breath shaking. If he answered, he saved himself. If he didn't, he saved her. Ranger looked up at him, then, not barking, not pushing, just watching with knowing eyes. Eyes that said, "We don't leave people behind." Frank closed his hand around the phone. Ring. 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 Each second screamed consequences. Ranger placed a paw gently on Frank's knee. Frank finally exhaled and pressed the button power off. The phone fell silent. "To hell with the rules," Frank muttered, voice raw. "Saving a life comes first." He climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and floored the accelerator, praying the tow chain would release cleanly. It snapped free with a metallic crack. The SUV behind them groaned like a dying creature before its weight pulled it down, tumbling into the ravine. Frank didn't look back. The woman was fading again, her head resting against Ranger's fur. Frank pressed the gas harder, headlights cutting tunnels through the blizzard. He didn't know her name. He didn't know how close death had come. But he knew one thing: he would not let her die tonight. The consequences would come later. For now, he had a stranger to protect, a storm to outrun, and a curfew already broken. The war had returned, and Frank Walker had chosen his side. The snowfall thickened into a suffocating curtain as Frank Walker steered the truck back toward Anchorage, the storm clawing at the vehicle like a desperate beast trying to drag them off the road. Every second counted, but he kept his movements controlled. Experience had taught him that panic kills faster than weather. Ranger stayed pressed against the stranger, his warm body a lifeline. The woman's breathing came in shallow bursts, each one weaker than the last, as though winter were stealing them from her one by one. Her skin had turned a worrying shade of grayish blue, the color of someone drifting perilously close to the horizon between life and loss. Frank glanced down just once, meeting Ranger's glowing eyes in the dim cabin. Those eyes were steady, loyal, demanding. He'd do what needed to be done. "Hang in there," Frank muttered, though he wasn't sure which of them he was saying it to. The hospital emergency entrance appeared like a salvation carved from light. A building of concrete and glass with glaring fluorescent signs cutting through the blizzard. Providence, Alaska Medical Center. The sliding doors trembled under the wind, but they held strong, a fortress against the merciless cold. Frank stopped the truck, heart hammering, as though afraid it would stop before he finished what he started. He scooped the woman into his arms. She was lightweight, frighteningly so, as if the storm had already eaten a part of her. Ranger leapt out beside him, barking to alert anyone who could help. The ER doors opened, and the warmth inside nearly smothered him with relief. A nurse sprang forward, Monica Reyes, a woman in her late 40s, with deep brown skin and a no-nonsense posture, built from years of saving lives others barely valued. Her black curly hair was tied back tightly, and her dark, focused eyes took in everything in a single blink. "What happened?" she demanded, reaching for the woman's wrist to check her pulse. "Found her in a wreck." Frank answered, breathing hard. "Car went off the road, freezing to death. She's hypothermic." Monica nodded sharply. "Get her to trauma room 1. She whistled for a nearby orderly, a tall, lanky young man named Chris, with sandy hair and a timid face still fresh from medical school. He pushed a stretcher forward and helped Frank lay the woman down. Ranger whined as they separated her from him, pacing anxiously, paws tapping the tile floor. "Sir, we need space," Monica said firmly, noticing Ranger's distress, like she'd seen 100 loyal animals protecting their person. "We'll take care of her." Frank hesitated but stepped back, commanding Ranger softly. "Easy. She's in good hands now." Ranger didn't move at first, but Frank's steady gaze finally convinced him to sit beside his leg, though tension rippled visibly down the dog's spine. Monica rushed into the trauma room, with the team disappearing behind heavy swinging doors. Frank found himself standing alone in a hallway that smelled of antiseptic fear and too many rushed goodbyes. The warmth should have comforted him, but instead, it made the cold inside him sharper, the cold born of uncertainty and dread. A police officer exited from a side hallway. Officer Miles Turner, young early 30s, clean-shaven face that belonged to someone who wanted to be a hero but hadn't yet learned heroes often pay the highest price. His uniform looked freshly pressed, his posture stiff with ambition. He noticed Frank's attire, the rugged flannel jacket the dog trained to obey with military precision, and his curiosity sharpened. "You bring that woman in?" Turner asked, voice professional, but tinged with suspicion, trained to see the worst before the truth. Frank nodded once, saying nothing more. "Did you see how the accident happened? Anyone else with her?" Frank shook his head. "Just found her like that." Turner narrowed his eyes slightly, sensing a detail left unspoken, but he lacked enough certainty to push further. "Name?" he asked. Frank hesitated too long. Ranger's ears twitched. Lying had never been part of Frank's nature, but telling the truth tonight could cost him everything: his home, his freedom, and Ranger's life. Before Turner could insist, another figure appeared, a doctor in a blue coat, wiping melted snow from metallic-framed glasses. Dr. Mason Clark, a man in his mid-50s with a salt-gray beard trimmed into neat lines, the kind of face that carried knowledge and exhaustion equally. His voice carried authority, softened by compassion. "Officer, we'll need his statement later. Let's give my staff time to stabilize the patient." Turner nodded, but didn't take his eyes off Frank. Frank exhaled slowly, turning toward the exit. Ranger bumped his leg gently, urging him to move. Every cell in Frank's body wanted to know if the woman would survive, but the police were here, and staying meant attention he couldn't afford. He had already broken curfew. Grimes would be coming. If Frank got arrested here, Ranger would be taken instantly. He couldn't risk that, not after choosing to save a stranger's life at the cost of his own freedom. He stepped backward toward the door that led to darkness. Turner's attention briefly shifted to a call on his radio. A fire somewhere downtown. People trapped. Duty pulled him away. That was the opening Frank needed. "Come on, boy," he whispered. Ranger followed silently, tail low. No barking, no sound, just the soft pad of paws against tile as they slipped through the doors and back into the ruthless storm. The moment the cold hit his skin again, Frank felt like he'd crossed a boundary, one that separated the righteous from the condemned. Snow whipped across his face, stinging like accusations he couldn't dodge. He climbed into the truck, Ranger curling tight beside him. The clock read 8:21 p.m. The red digits might as well have spelled criminal. His phone remained dead in his pocket, silent proof that he had chosen humanity over law. Frank stared blankly through the windshield, the hospital lights blurring as frost crept inward. Somewhere inside that building, a woman he didn't know was fighting for her life. Somewhere else, a system he could no longer trust was preparing to come for him. Ranger nudged his shoulder drive. They needed to return home before the storm erased the road entirely. As he pulled onto the highway again, headlights cutting through an endless blizzard, Frank felt a familiar unease crawling up his spine. The kind that told him life had shifted direction, that there would be a price to pay. But he also felt something else, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Purpose. Ranger rested his head on Frank's lap, calmer now, mission complete. Frank reached down, ruffling the dog's fur. "We did the right thing," he murmured. He said it like a question, but Ranger accepted it as a fact. The hospital lights shrank into the storm behind them, swallowed by darkness, as Frank Walker disappeared into the night, unknown, unrecognized, and already one step closer to the consequences waiting on the other side of dawn. Snow softened into slush as winter reluctantly loosened its grip on Anchorage. The world outside Frank Walker's cabin no longer looked like a battlefield of white and wind. It looked like a thaw, a chance, the first slow breath of spring. But inside Frank's chest, the storm hadn't passed. He sat on a stiff wooden bench in the courtroom, his fingers scraping at the fraying seam of his red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket. Ranger lay curled at his feet, head resting on paws, amber eyes tracking every movement with quiet vigilance. Frank tried not to show anxiety, but his jaw clenched every time the door creaked. Courtrooms had never felt like a place for a man like him. They were too clean, too quiet. The kind of quiet that judged. The previous judge, a man whose indifference was almost hostile, had been replaced for unavailability. Frank never learned why. All he knew was that his lawyer Leo Finch looked nervous in his wrinkled suit as he paced, clutching a folder so tight the papers inside might suffocate. The bailiff announced, "All rise." Frank rose with the room expecting another stern face ready to declare him a burden to society. Instead, the woman who stepped up to the bench made his breath catch. She had long brown hair, now brushed and tied neatly behind her head, not frozen and tangled like the night he found her. Her skin held color again, soft ivory instead of ice-bitten blue. Her figure was slender inside a dark navy judge's robe posture, upright, like someone who had fought storms of her own and learned to never bend. Most striking were her eyes blue as thawing ice beneath sunlight, eyes that scanned the room with authority and quiet emotion intertwined. Judge Emily Harris, a woman in her mid-30s with a composed expression, though something warmer flickered beneath it when her gaze fell on the dog. Ranger recognized her first. He stood up, ears perking, then trotted forward before Frank could stop him. People gasped. The bailiff reached for his weapon. But Ranger wasn't attacking. He rested his chin gently on the judge's bench, exactly as he had pressed his head into her chest while warming her in that doomed SUV. Emily's face softened, shock and memory all at once. She whispered, "You." Her hand steady despite everything stroked Ranger's fur. Frank's heart pounded, confusion and fear wrestling behind his ribs. Did she remember? Did she know? She cleared her throat and regained her formal tone, though warmth lingered in her voice. "Defense, proceed." Leo shot Frank a wide-eyed look of hope. The young lawyer stepped forward, adjusting his glasses. "Your Honor, the accusation that Mr. Walker stole a microprocessor control unit hinges on a single piece of planted packaging found at his residence. He was set up. Prosecutor DeWitt, a woman in her 40s, sharp bob haircut, and lips thinned in perpetual skepticism, rose with a smirk. "Objection. Baseless speculation." Emily raised a hand. "Overruled." "Continue, Mr. Finch." Leo nodded and opened the folder. "We have obtained the truck's telematics report from Iron North Auto Repair the night the supposed theft occurred." He passed the documents to the clerk. The truck Mr. Walker allegedly drove to steal the part never left the garage. The odometer was unchanged. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Derek Samuels, sitting stiffly behind the prosecution table, paled visibly. His slicked-back blonde hair no longer looked confident. It looked like armor cracking around a guilty man. Leo pressed further. "Furthermore, the original component packaging shows no fingerprints except Mr. Samuels and his lead mechanic." He gestured sharply toward Derek. Mr. Samuels falsified an order form, planted the packaging in Mr. Walker's trash, and reported a fabricated theft, all because Mr. Walker refused to install substandard dangerous parts. Frank stared at Leo's stunned admiration, pushing aside despair. Maybe the young lawyer had more steel than nerves after all. Prosecutor DeWitt fired questions at Derek, but his responses tangled contradictions piling up like debris after a wreck. Emily watched quietly observant, letting the truth unravel itself. Finally, she leaned forward, voice calm but commanding. "Mr. Samuels, do you deny ordering the inferior lateral control rods Mr. Walker objected to?" Derek's mouth opened, closed. He stuttered. His walls caved. "They were cheaper," he muttered. "And customers don't know any different." Emily's eyes turned cold. "But Mr. Walker did. So you silenced him with a felony accusation." Derek's silence was admission enough. Emily's decision came swiftly. "Charges against Mr. Walker are dismissed with prejudice." Then she turned toward Derek. "Mr. Samuels, you are hereby placed under arrest for perjury, fraud, and reckless endangerment." The bailiff cuffed him as rage twisted Derek's features into something small and pathetic. Frank stood frozen, as if his body no longer knew how to be free. Ranger nudged his leg, tail wagging. "It's over." Emily looked directly at Frank for the first time with no mask of authority between them. Gratitude shone clearly in her eyes, though she couldn't speak it here. The gavel fell. Court adjourned. That evening, as Frank sat on his porch watching the snow melt into spring mud, Ranger's ears perked at the sound of footsteps on the gravel road. A small sedan pulled up. Emily stepped out now, dressed in a simple beige coat and jeans. Humanity replacing the robe, fragility replacing the bench. Frank stood not sure whether to smile or apologize. Emily approached slowly, hands in pockets, breath forming small clouds in the fading chill. "I never got to thank you," she said. "You saved my life." Frank rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly awkward. Heroism never fit comfortably on him. Anyone would have done the same. "No," Emily corrected gently. "Not anyone. You chose prison over passing by. You let the world punish you so I could breathe." She blinked away emotion. "I don't forget debts like that." Ranger trotted forward, tail sweeping the air, before pressing himself against her legs, seeking affection like greeting an old friend. Emily laughed softly, running fingers through his thick fur. In that moment, even with uncertainty ahead, even with scars unhealed, Frank felt something shift inside him. The loneliness that had ruled his life no longer felt like a sentence. Ranger nudged Emily's hand toward Frank as if to say, "See, we're a pack now." Emily looked up. "May I visit again?" Frank nodded once, then again, with a small, genuine smile that warmed the chill. "Yeah, I'd like that." The three stood together on the porch as the first evening stars pierced the blanket of night. Frost retreated. Hearts thawed. A new season and a new family began. In the end, Frank, Emily, and Ranger remind us that sometimes God's miracles don't arrive with thunder or light. They come quietly through the hands of ordinary people who choose compassion over convenience, courage over fear, and love over comfort. Maybe it was chance that guided Frank into that blizzard. Maybe it was instinct. But some of us believe that on nights like that, when the world feels cold and unforgiving, God places the right souls on the same road at the same time. And in your own life, the miracle you're praying for might be closer than you think, in a stranger's kindness, in a door that opens when you expected it shut, or in the strength you didn't know you still carried. Hold on. Keep faith. Trust that the Lord still works in small, unexpected ways, even through weary hearts like Frank's, or loyal guardians like Ranger. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs hope today. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what part moved you most. And if you'd like more stories of courage, grace, and second chances, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and your family. May He guide your steps, warm your spirit, and protect your home just as he watched over Frank, Emily, and Ranger on the coldest night of their lives.